My first book was The Liberated Man. In it, I shared my feelings about the importance of independent women for secure men, and I discussed the contribution of the women's movement in fostering women's self-discovery. My mother's premature death was due in part to not living at a time in which she was encouraged to explore all aspects of herself, and her death was part of the motivation that led me to spend 3 years on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City, an experience that I think deepened my excitement about women's potential. That was in the 70s. As the women's movement moved from mocked to mainstream, I increasingly sensed an anger toward men that permeated our culture, and it was about as unnoticed as bacteria is in water. Women were basically asking, why are men such jerks? And why are men afraid of commitment? And men were sort of confused. Why would a woman want commitment from a jerk? As women were speaking, they were wondering, why can't men listen? And as they pleaded for intimacy, they often feared that men cared only about sex. The 600 or so women's and men's groups I had formed were helping me hear what was behind women's anger and what men could barely say. The findings took the form of my book, Why Men Are the Way They Are. That was the 80s. I felt mixed emotions about these decades, as if they were the best of times and the worst of times between the sexes. The sexes have never communicated as much, nor have they ever divorced as much. They've never known so much about raising a child's self-esteem, and yet never left their children so destabilized. The male role has never been so successful at expanding women's life expectancy, which has increased by over 50% in the 20th century. And yet men have never been so blamed for women's neglect. In retrospect, I saw the 50s as the decade of the family, the 60s the decade of men, encouraging freedom, sex without marriage, and questioning authority. And the last 3 decades I see more as the decades of women. Unfortunately, while the decade of men also released women in terms of birth control, professional choices, and sexual self-discovery, the decades of women are in many ways a dark age for men. Since the beginning of the women's movement, the suicide rate for women has decreased by 1/3, while the suicide rate for men has increased by 15%. Yet we've focused only on damage to women's self-esteem. Something was going on. By the late 80s, the anger toward men had become institutionalized. It was dividing families. It was poisoning love. The newest dirty word was a 3-letter word: men. The women's movement had done a wonderful job of freeing women from sex roles, but no one did the same for men. The more women gained advantages, the more its movement went from favoring equality to fearing equality. Big feminism became like big labor. Both started by correcting an imbalance. Both became so preoccupied with getting protection that soon everyone near them needed protection from them. I began to feel that as women spoke up and men didn't, masculinity was becoming demonized, and the baby was being thrown out with the bathwater. Soon I began distinguishing among the feminism I loved what I now call empowerment feminism, and the 2 forms of feminism I feared: victim feminism and competitive feminism. Empowerment feminism empowers a woman by encouraging her to develop all her potential without regard to gender. It's the feminism I'll always support. Victim feminism focuses on how men in society systematically view women as second-class citizens, and any accomplishments a woman achieves are despite these barriers. Competitive feminism does not stop with saying women have it bad. It says that women have it worse than men, that women's victimhood was caused by men. It arrives at these conclusions by exaggerating women's burdens and understating men's burdens. For 6 years, I sorted out my feelings on these issues, and I worked to make the material offered in my book, The Myth of Male Power, a new paradigm of men in power and a more progressive male-female dance. I had come to feel that men's traditional definition of power did not give men real power. Men had come to define power as feeling obligated to earn money that someone else spends while he dies sooner. The myth of male power redefined power as controlling one's own life.